I think more people have the adventure opportunity than realize that they do.
During a pandemic, it seems hard to think about your next adventure. The routine of staying in one place dulls one's expectations. Yet I suspect that many of us are thinking about what's next and preparing ourselves for a new challenge. Welcome to MakeCast. I'm Dale Doherty. MakeCast is brought to you by the members of Make Community. To learn more about becoming a member, visit make.co. David Lang is someone who found himself by looking for adventure, which he talked about in his book Zero to Maker, that shares his experiences going from someone who knew nothing about making to becoming a maker at TechShop. Eventually, he met Eric Stackpole, and the two of them started OpenROV and worked for many years to create a low-cost platform for underwater exploration. You might have seen Eric and David at Maker Faire Bay Area, standing beside an above-ground pool and letting people take turns controlling their underwater robots. After OpenROV had merged with another company, David worked there for a while before deciding last fall to leave and find something new. In this conversation, which took place in December 2020, David talks about the difficulty of starting over. He has been exploring new ways to look at scientists and what they do, a view that might connect them more closely to makers. David is an open and inspiring person, and while he admits that figuring out what's next is scary, you can feel how it is also re-energizing him. On Medium, you said you were looking for other pragmatic idealists. I really like that term.
I wrote that piece just to update the rest of the world about what's been going on for me internally for this whole year, which is it's been a period of transition. I'm stepped away from the ocean tech business and starting something new. And it was interesting to write that piece because I really had this opportunity to reflect on just everything that had happened. And in digging through my emails, I found an email exchange from Eric and I when we first met, and it was exactly 10 years ago, December of 2010. And that email exchange just had everything you hoped it would, which is Eric and I going back and forth about underwater robot ideas and our dreams and hopes for the future. It was just two people who found some overlapping interest and a shared excitement between us. And that was the beginning of a conversation and a friendship and really quite an adventure over the past 10 years. It was fun to reflect.
One of the words you used once that I've always kept up, and it was a sense of adventure. In the sense, you and Eric took off on an adventure, and the adventure involved building things and exploring the world, interacting with lots of people. And always when you use that word made me think, I think a lot of people are looking for adventure in their lives, not just work, but adventure. Mm-hmm. And obviously not everybody has that opportunity, but
I think more people have the adventure opportunity than realize that they do. Mm-hmm. And I have a kind of a specific definition I use for adventure, which is the edge of what you think is possible for yourself. I use the term exploration to define what's the edge of what humans collectively know and can do. Mm-hmm. And I use the term adventure for that kind of that edge that you have for yourself. And I think that can take a lot of different forms for different people. But I do actually think it's more widely available than people give themselves credit for. And I think the pandemic has shaken up what we all think of in terms of traveling and exploring and getting out, and was an opportunity to reset everybody's expectations for that. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of people who are finding new ways to creatively get outside, explore, ask questions, learn new skills in their house, in their backyard, in their communities, which I think that's really healthy.
Adventure is getting outside of the normal, and the pandemic has pushed us outside the normal. Mm-hmm. And so there are a lot of people that are making some kind of transition or thinking about it during this period. They're at least questioning how they work, what they do at work, what their life's about. So I think that's interesting.
I have a really vivid memory. Maybe you remember this too. It was you and I, and you were hosting a meeting in Sausalito, and it was us, and it was a bunch of other business people, right? Like investors and consultants, and they were asking you and me questions and others about the maker movement and what were these companies going to turn into? How were they going to get big? And that idea, that was something that you said then, is maybe they don't get big, but maybe they all just have a good adventure. You used that term back then. So It's interesting to think back on that moment.
Mm-hmm. I do believe that a lot of what the maker movement is about, that personal journey. And yours, you end up writing for us of Zero to Maker book of how you walked into TechShop and began to figure out you didn't quite know what you wanted to do even before you met Eric, but you knew what you were not wanting to do, which I resonate a lot with.
Oh yeah. I think if you've got it all planned out, then it's definitely not going to be an adventure. I think you have to wander into the unknown.
Can you talk a bit about walking into TechShop back then and what that was like for you? Because what I really felt was so valuable about your perspective, and what I've tried to convey to people a lot, is some people assume that maker is something you're born with, something that you just assume at an early age, this is the kind of person you are. And clearly some people are like that. But I believe the majority of people, it's just something they decide they want to do. And for a variety of reasons. And they learn how to do it.
Yeah.
And it seemed like you were one of those folks.
Yeah, it's interesting because I did have that kind of visceral feeling of, I'm not a handy person. I'm not someone who makes things. And I think that was a barrier to a whole suite of possibilities in my life. And the TechShop experience was really powerful because they really did welcome folks like that. If you came in and they had the dream coach, the person who would sit you down and say, what are you thinking about? What are you interested in learning? What's the crazy idea you want to make? And they would help you plot it out as a coach. But the thing that was the most surprising and the most interesting to me was how much making was a group activity. And the people in TechShop, right? Like every corner of the shop, every machine had someone who knew it best. And that's the person you went to get that done. It's interesting because we're thinking about buying an old wooden boat right now to live on in here in Seattle. And everyone will try and talk you out of an old wooden boat. And it's nerve-wracking, even for me, having been around boats and spent time at TechShop, it's still a nerve-wracking thing. But we went and spent time with some shipwrights, and now we're building this network of people who know how to do the different components of maintaining and fixing up an old wooden boat. And it's much less scary. And it reminded me of that TechShop experience of something seeming so intimidating, but then realizing that the right thing to focus on was that you need to remake your network, right? You need to invite all of these other people who can show you what's possible. Because no one knows how to do everything. I think that's a real myth, that there's some makers who know how to build anything and are totally self-sufficient.
And I'd say that a lot of people are able to do stuff without being the best at it. They have different levels of skills, and it's often more important that you just try it than it is to be really good at it.
And it's actually really hard to get back into that beginner mindset. I wrote a whole book on it, and I thought I really understood it. And here I am now in this moment where I'm walking away from the things that are known and comfortable, which is the OpenROV, which became so far. And there was this company and these products and all these things. And I've wandered back into this kind of transition period where I'm trying to learn new things and new skills. And it doesn't, even though I've done it before, it doesn't make it any less scary. And it doesn't change the fact that trying new things and trying to learn new things kicks up all of your deepest insecurities. Oh, I'm not going to be good at this, or I don't know if I could do this. It's so consistent. And even though I've done it before, it doesn't change that fact. So I think like acknowledging that fear and the potential for those kind of wandering over that bridge to be scary and to be against what's comfortable and natural.
Yeah. And which also means why it's important to be around other people. during that time to find other people that are having similar feelings and similar experiences.
And no doubt about it. And so I don't know that I've told you what I'm doing now is I'm seeing a lot of energy and excitement in this space on the edge of science. So not the kind of ivory tower academics who are publishing papers, but a group of entrepreneurs and makers and technologists who are rejecting this idea of I want to publish papers and get on this tenure track and really rethinking science from the ground up, like the foundational aspects of what is curiosity, how best should we share our ideas and collaborate. And it reminds me a lot of the maker movement 10 years ago when it was these passionate amateurs, and I say that with the highest respect, discovering each other and finding a common denominator amongst themselves. And I'm doing something similar to that I did with Zero to Maker. I have this website called Science Better, and I do something very similar to this where I invite scientists on and I ask them what they're interested in, what they're researching. And then I have them share their screen and kind of walk me through their research process. Where do they get ideas? How do they take notes? How do they organize thoughts into papers? And it's just been really interesting to have scientists walk me through all of their processes and demystifying.
Give me an example of someone that you've had on your program.
So Shannon Dozmagan from Public Lab, she was one of my first interviews, and she is also in one of these transition phases and showed me how she's thinking about environmental data. So she's really approached science from a different perspective than researchers do, which is, have an idea. She goes into the community and kind of coaxes hypotheses and questions out of the group. And it's a really different way of thinking. So I got her to talk about her tactics.
She's moved on to Kennedy School or something?
She's got a fellowship with Shuttleworth, and she's working on solving some of these bigger environmental data problems. Last week, I interviewed Josh Nicholson, who created this website called Site, which is a really interesting kind of plugin for Chrome or whatever browser you use. And it allows you to see not just the citations for a paper, but how many times those papers have been refuted or supported. So not just a mention, but actually they call them smart citations. And it's an amazing way. It's an amazing superpower. I think it's like a X-ray vision for reading through scientific literature. Anyway, so Josh Nicholson created Site.
I remember back when you were doing OpenROV, you had side projects related to science. And I always thought you were trying to, in some ways, find the makers in the science community and also create sort of a bridge between the two. I've certainly seen this myself, that a lot of experimental scientists, when you get them talking about the lab, they see themselves as makers very much. But there is this sort of academic view of science sometimes where it is more papers and writing and lots of other things. And it sometimes sits on top of what is the experimental foundation.
Exactly. And I'm also working with the folks at experiment.com. So helping them out to imagine what the future of scientific funding is. So yeah, this opportunity is stepping away from the ocean tech business has just allowed me to rekindle all of these other passions that I've had. And I think that's a sign of them being a good direction to go in. Is they haven't gotten less interesting. They've actually gotten more interesting. So yeah, it's been fun to go back and to throw some wood on those old coals and explore some of those ideas. And I do think they're very related to the maker world. And
I think what you're talking about a lot is not just what the result was, but how did you do it? What was the experiment? And how did you even think of doing it this way? Yeah,
absolutely. And I picked up a book called The Discoveries by Alan Lightman, which he puts together the 25 most important discoveries from the 20th century, in his opinion. And he writes a preface for every one, a foreword. And I love this idea of the activity that goes on around the science. Like, how did they get the idea? What did their laboratories look like? What mistakes did they make along the way? I think there's a whole part of that world that is hidden. And it's hidden not on purpose, but scientists aren't incentivized to put it on display. And I think it's a real loss, actually. And I think it's part of the reasons that there's such a shaky foundation for science in our society right now. We're going to have a vaccine in the next few months, and I'm reading reports that close to 50% of people aren't going to take it. That's really scary, and I think that speaks to this rift between science and society that the academy is not doing enough to address.
I would agree. Science can look like just an authority system, right? This is because we say this, you're supposed to believe it. And in fact, it's something that they can demonstrate why they think something is true. All scientific knowledge is contingent on that ability to prove it and equally disprove it.
I have a working theory that I'd love to run by you.
Yeah.
And as you react to it, I'd love for you to put on your maker hat and tell me about how this was either true or not true for your experience creating this maker tent. Okay, my theory right now is that science is missing a persona. Is that scientists talk about themselves, they're scientists, and then the general public as this other. And there's no kind of middle ground. And I think they're missing the amateur. And it reminds me a lot of the maker world and this idea that there was technologists and the general public, but you created this really vibrant community that was oriented around amateurism, people who were doing it just for the love of what it was, not for the business of it, not because it was the most efficient thing. But science doesn't have that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it does, but it doesn't often. It is innate curiosity. It's to me almost an example I see educationally. Sometimes we need more people in STEM, right? Mm-hmm. That's the goal. Rather than we need to develop their curiosity and encourage them to explore the world and see all the things that it holds for them, the exploration, the adventure, if you will. And I think those are just different ways of framing it that are pretty important. Like sometimes people say makers are just hobbyists. And first of all, I go, what's wrong with that if that's true? What I take from that, or the idea of amateurs, is something they would do anyway. They don't need, they're motivated to do this because of who they are and what they discover, even the communities they belong to. And people that study mushrooms and people that study the stars or experience these things. It's part of their life. And it's part of having a diverse and varied life that you explore these things at a level that satisfies your mind and your body in a way. I think that is where science sometimes gets caught up. It's just a career for some people. And it comes across that way. It's just my job. And we know that there are people out there that are just darn curious about things, and they make it into a career. But that's the origins or the roots of it are in that enthusiasm and that sense of adventure.
Oh, 100%. And I use the term amateur with the French meaning.
Obviously, the science was founded as an amateur, as the Royal Society, and most of the people in it were doing this on the side, trying to share their knowledge.
But if you think about it, one of the earliest lessons every entrepreneur learns is, if everyone is your customer, then no one is your customer.
Right.
Like you really want to make sure you're oriented towards that group of people who are going to love it. And it's okay if not everyone gets it. And I think that's the theory that I'm saying to the science communication world is it can't just be science in the general public. Like we need to nurture this amateur persona, because that will help orient the messaging.
The idea is you want to take the general public and get them to participate. You don't want to just tell them what they should think. I noticed a bit in your Medium article talking about biodiversity, talking about climate change. These are things we need people to be involved in, not just listen or pay attention to. What are the actions that people can get involved in? I don't mean just like recycling. What are the things that really consume who they are? And there are some people out there doing this, but I think that's, you kind of mentioned something like citizen science, and I think there were two views of that as an example is, well, you went out and did some science, like collect some data, but in some ways you really weren't doing science. You were just you were just a data collector. And then, but there are other examples where people actually, I think Shannon's group was great. Why is my lake polluted? What's causing that? And how do I know that it is polluted? And what are the sources of that pollution? It's really getting involved and doing stuff. And you don't need a degree to do that. You don't need permission to do that. And I think those are the two things that I come from the maker movement. Is even going to COVID-19 here, very few of the makers or the maker spaces were trained to do medical devices or build medical equipment. But there was a need there. And they said, we can figure this out and we can do it. And I think that sort of inclination to action is I think, a really important ingredient to have in society.
I agree. I think, this bias towards action and the cultivating agency, I think, is one of the great exports of the maker movement, is this kind of permission to do. Right. And I just, regarding the biodiversity stuff, I just recorded a Science Better interview with Alex Deegan, who runs Conservation X Labs. Right. And the biodiversity challenge is actually very different than we were talking about, comparing the conservation and biodiversity with climate change, which are two different problems. And the interesting thing about the biodiversity challenge, and he talked about this with the work he was doing on lemurs in Madagascar, is when he started, they knew about 13 lemurs. And now there are species of lemurs. Yeah. And now there are more than 100. And 90% of their habitat has been lost. So we're still discovering what's there at the same time that we're losing so much in such a dramatic fashion. And I told him the story of my volunteering and involvement with a group in San Francisco called Nature in the City that I found a lot of hope and agency with. And they're creating butterfly habitat and corridors throughout San Francisco for the green hair-streaked butterfly and others. And I just told him that this was, during some kind of hard moments for me, this was a real point of solace and of hope. It was just going out on Saturday mornings and pulling up invasive species and planting habitat. And we talked about drawdown for climate change, where they have this big board of all the things we need to do to draw down carbon. And this idea that solving the biodiversity crisis might be more personal than that. And the right way to look at what we need to do is personal. And it's oriented from where you are. What's going on in your backyard? What's going on with species in your neighborhood? This is not just about saving places in the tropics or halfway around the world. There's a lot to be done where you are, and helping folks, A, recognize that, but then B, be inspired to actually get involved and to take action. Because I promise you, if you do, there's a fountain of meaning there to be tapped. And I think that's what a lot of folks are aching for, is more meaning. And hey, here's an opportunity.
It comes from figuring out there's something for you to do and how to do it. They'll eventually figure out something to do on their own, right? They develop skills to contribute in meaningful ways.
So what's your latest thinking on that? How do we do that? I remember the conversations we had about marathons, right? This is a hard thing to do, yes, and lots of people are doing it. What's your latest thinking around how to instill agency?
I think two things are true right now, partially because of the pandemic. A lot of makerspaces have closed, some permanently. Others are opening in limited ways. We were successful at getting lots of makerspaces out there, but I don't know that many people had your TechShop experience, that they walk into a makerspace and there's enough there to hold them so that 4 or 5 months later, they become skilled and they walk away thinking that they can do stuff. And I still think that's the challenge, that we need to we're starting a program called Learning Labs, just try to create some model programs, say 4-month programs for particular older students, maybe that are in between college and high school, and thinking about who they are, what they're good at, what they want to do. I still think our education system is not delivering that kind of guidance to people. They can't, and so they're expecting to get it from college, but they often don't, and they're paying a lot of money for that funding. So I'm interested in how we can provide perhaps a little bit more structure around that, sort of changing a maker movement in certain ways that it becomes more purposeful. People need to organize, as we have around COVID-19, in groups to get things done. It isn't just about your own project, but figuring out what needs to be done. And the fact that we can learn from all the makers, all the people that are out there can teach something, can help other people. You mentioned the dream coaches. I don't know how many maker spaces copied that element of TechShop, but it was a pretty important element, that sort of coaching and mentoring. And I really think coaching is a skill set that needs to be developed, maybe even certified in the maker community of working with kids, and really to help someone realize an idea as a project, as a prototype, and turn it into something that they're satisfied with. So I think in some ways, I think we need to be more intentional about the pathways that help people get from one state to a different state.
There's a lot to unpack there. So much of this gets down to behavior design. And really thinking through what is actually going to change get someone from here to there. And I just came across BJ Fogg's research at Stanford around behavior design and the habits, but also they were looking at persuasive technology and just the broader field of behavior design in general. And now they're starting to think about how do we apply this to climate change and how do we apply this to other problems? And it's so relevant, right? To actually think about those questions that you're asking in actually a scientific way. Like what actually does get people to change? When I think about the kind of the TechShop aspect, what it did for me was, I think I did this accidentally through kind of the zero to maker thing, because I immersed myself and then walked out of there with a new social network. And I think that was really critical. And I did one of these 10-day silent meditation retreats last year. I came away from that, one, with it was an interesting experience, but two, just the power of training and immersion and those kind of boot camp type things that throw you in.
That's what we're doing with Learning Lab, is trying to get this sort of 4-month kind of immersion program as a model, because I think a lot of it is having enough time to practice things where they become it's like sports or music, anything. You just you really have to immerse yourself in the thing, learning a language to do those things. You'll never be good at a sport if you do a 20-minute activity once a week, which is a lot of how making is taught in schools, for instance.
I love that idea. So then will this be like a curriculum, or is it a network of people? And then will maker spaces be able to implement them?
The idea is to build a model program that we could share with maker spaces so that other people could run it. But to keep cohorts of about 12 or so, we're going to start a pilot program. I'm interested in young people that have been impacted by COVID-19, meaning they haven't gone back to school or they're unemployed, and taking from that group. But yeah, we have a 3-phase program. Nancy Otero is a director of learning developing this program. But there's kind of a onboarding phase, there's a immersion phase, there's a deep dive phase. And then really the part that matters a lot to me is this kind of open project development, to really come up with your own idea, do the research to figure out a problem and come up with a prototype to that problem and test it. I think a lot of young people have not had that experience of actually doing something like that. That's what our program's grounded in, is scaffolding in a way so that they can have that experience and they can walk away with being able to share that experience and say, I did this. It goes in a portfolio or it goes into something they can share with a future employer.
Yeah, there's so much power in that. I think when I think back at the most formative moment of my life was when I was 22 and I had gotten out of college, and I decided that I was going to move to San Francisco and live on a sailboat and learn how to sail. And everyone thought this was such a weird thing because I was coming from Minnesota and never really spent time on the water. But I did it. It's not like OpenROV where there was stories about it and a company. It was a personal thing, but it was my idea. I think it was one of the first times. It wasn't just the next thing, like the go to school, study this, do this, go to college. This was the first time that I reached down and found something that was my own idea. And I think there's so much power in that. And it's a really simple notion.
But sometimes
once
hard, especially in educational context, it's hard to develop the trust in the student to allow them to have their own idea. So, and yet I think the sparks of creativity come from owning that idea, and no matter whatever shape it comes in. And I think that's just like you can trace OpenROV back to a conversation you had with Eric. These things develop out of such kind of informal things. And I think sometimes as a society, we lose sight of that. We think OpenROV came from a business plan, or it came from
certainly not
formal accelerator or things. And it came from what you're saying, two people getting their heads together and saying, there's something to be done here. And wow, this would be incredible if we could do it. And not knowing if you can.
And actually, at the time, not really being able to do it. I think there were some things that our initial ideas and sketches were impossible. And there was a famous, really well-known ROV designer, really experienced guy who had just retired, was so nice to take our phone calls and listen to our pitches and our ideas. And he said, I hate to tell you this, guys, but this just isn't really going to work. And many years later, after OpenROV got going and got off the ground, Eric was giving a talk somewhere, and this guy was in the audience, and he stood up and and at the end, in this question and answer session, he said, Eric, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry that I told you guys that, and I'm so glad you guys didn't listen to me. But so the moral of the story is we were full of bad ideas. We kept moving forward just because we had way more enthusiasm than knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was one of the lessons for us is make sure the furnace is full of enthusiasm. And every time someone came in contact with us, whether it was someone we were telling about the project or it was at Maker Faire, we always wanted to make sure that they left more excited and interested than when they first, learned about it. So it was a simple formula of just making sure that the fire of enthusiasm was always burning.
Yeah.
It took a long time.
Enthusiasm is the currency of the maker movement. It's like what you exchange. You get it from other people and you give it to other people. And hopefully it continues to grow.
Yeah, but it's very rare that's nurtured. I'm going through this science, interviewing scientists, and it's shocking how often that is stamped out of folks, right? Like even people coming to experiment is, well, what are you most curious about? And they think, I need to get this published, and I need to do this because this is going to advance my career in this way. It's like, no, what are you actually, what's the question you really want to answer? Because those are the ones that are really going to be successful.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It reminds me, Tim O'Reilly organized those food camps, and what he really wanted was people to show up and talk about what they were interested in, not what their job was, not their job title, not how important they were, but just like what's interesting. And I think he understood it rightly, that people eventually follow their interests, and that leads into the future in interesting ways that sometimes what they think they should be doing doesn't, or what they're supposed to be doing doesn't. But just what they're curious about leads them into new directions, especially with technology. They explore that because they find it interesting. We don't always know why they find it interesting, but that they do.
So this is how I start all of my Science Better interviews, is I ask folks, okay, what are all your browser tabs open to? What's the question you're really trying to get to the bottom of right now? And people are really guarded, but the folks who really open up about what they're poking around in, I think get a lot more out of the interview, because it exposes the way that they actually do research about something.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. And so you're in Seattle, you're in the midst of a transition, but you're already doing new things to see where they lead. And please stay in touch and let me know how things develop for you. I'm sure they'll lead to interesting places, a new adventure.